The Inheritance of Lies. A story of betrayal, awakening, and the price of blind trust. On the morning of my 80th birthday, my granddaughter Melissa handed me a cup of coffee and whispered something that made my blood turn to ice. "Grandma Eleanor," she said, her voice trembling, "I found something in Dad's office. Something about Grandpa's money. Something you need to see." I stared at her young face, at the tears forming in her eyes, and I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to crack. She pressed a crumpled document into my palm, and I unfolded it slowly, my arthritic fingers struggling with the paper. When I read the first line, my heart stopped beating. Trust Fund Account Summary. Eleanor Marie Patterson. Principal amount, $750,000. Status, fully disbursed. I had never seen this document in my entire life. I had never received a single penny, and my son Richard's signature was at the bottom of every withdrawal. But I need to take you back to who I was before that moment, back to the woman who believed that suffering in silence was the highest form of love. My name is Eleanor Marie Patterson. I was born in 1944 in a small farming town in Kansas, where women learned 3 things before they learned to read: how to cook, how to clean, and how to disappear. We were taught that our voices were decorations, meant to be seen but never truly heard. We were taught that a good wife never questioned, never complained, never demanded. I married Harold Patterson when I was 19 years old. He was a quiet man who worked as an insurance executive for 42 years. He wore the same style of suit every day, drank his coffee black, and read the newspaper from front to back every morning without speaking a word. I thought that was love. I thought silence was security. We had one son, Richard. From the moment he was born, I poured everything I had into him. I stayed up with him through every fever, every nightmare, every teenage heartbreak. I sold my grandmother's pearls to pay for his college applications. I wore the same 3 dresses for a decade, so he could have new clothes for school. I sacrificed everything, and I did it gladly because that's what mothers do. That's what I was taught a mother's love looked like. Harold died 8 years ago. A stroke took him in his sleep, peaceful and sudden. I was devastated, not because we had a passionate love, but because I didn't know who I was without someone to serve. For 47 years, I had been someone's wife. Now I was no one. Richard handled everything after the funeral. He said it was too complicated for me to understand. He said there were debts, obligations, legal matters that needed a professional touch. He patted my hand like I was a child and told me not to worry. "Dad left you a small pension, Mom," he said. "It's not much, but it'll keep you comfortable." Comfortable. That word still burns in my throat. The pension was $650 a month. The apartment Richard found for me was $400 a month, a 1-bedroom unit in a building called Sunset Gardens, which was neither sunny nor garden-like. It was a concrete box with thin walls and a heating system that groaned like a dying animal every winter. I learned to budget every penny. I learned which grocery store sold the cheapest bread. I learned to eat 1 meal a day so I could afford my medications. I learned to tell myself that this was enough, that I was lucky, that other people had it worse. Richard visited once a month, sometimes less. He would breeze in smelling of expensive cologne, his designer watch catching the light, his car keys jingling impatiently in his pocket. He would hand me $150 in cash and tell me it was a little extra to help out. I would thank him like he was giving me the world. His wife, Victoria, never came with him. She said she was busy with her charity work, her tennis lessons, her social obligations. The few times I saw her, she looked at me like I was a stain she couldn't quite identify. She kissed the air beside my cheek and called me Eleanor instead of Mom, and I told myself it didn't hurt. My grandchildren, Melissa and Thomas, were strangers with familiar faces. They grew up in a 6-bedroom house with a swimming pool and a tennis court. They attended private schools that cost more per year than I had ever earned in my entire working life. When I visited for holidays, they barely looked up from their phones. They called me Grandma in flat voices and excused themselves as quickly as possible. I watched Richard's life bloom while mine withered, and I never questioned it. He must have worked so hard. He must have been so smart with his money. He must have inherited his father's business sense. I never once suspected that everything he had was built on my bones. The years passed in a gray blur. I developed arthritis in my hands, then my knees. I had a minor heart attack that landed me in the hospital for 3 days. Richard came to visit once for 20 minutes. He brought flowers that were already wilting and told me he was in the middle of a big deal. Couldn't stay long, but he was glad I was okay. I told him I understood. I told him work was important. I told him not to worry about me. The hospital bill was $12,000. My insurance covered most of it, but I still owed $2,000. I sold my wedding ring to pay it. I told myself Harold would have understood. My only friend was a woman named Dorothy, who lived in the apartment across the hall. She was 82 years old with sharp blue eyes and a tongue that could cut glass. Her children called her every day. They visited every weekend. They took her on vacations to Florida and sent her flowers for no reason at all. I envied her with a quiet, shameful intensity. "Eleanor," Dorothy said one afternoon over our usual tea, "why does your son never come around? Why are you always alone?" "He's busy," I said automatically. "He has a demanding career. He does what he can." Dorothy snorted. "My son has a demanding career too. He's a surgeon, operates on hearts all day long. But he still finds time to call his mother. Still finds time to make sure I'm not rotting away in some forgotten corner." "Richard isn't like that," I protested weakly. "Then what is he like, Eleanor?"
"Tell me."
"Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like he's forgotten you exist." I couldn't answer her. I couldn't defend him anymore. Because deep down, in a place I never allowed myself to visit, I knew she was right. Everything changed 3 months before my 80th birthday. I received a letter in the mail. It was from a law firm I had never heard of, addressed to me personally. The envelope was thick, expensive, official-looking. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Dear Mrs. Patterson, we are writing to inform you of a discrepancy discovered during a routine audit of the Patterson Family Trust. Our records indicate that you are the primary beneficiary of a trust fund established by your late husband, Harold James Patterson, in the amount of $750,000. According to our files, this trust was to provide you with monthly payments of $3,500 for the remainder of your life. However, we have discovered that all funds were withdrawn and the account closed 8 years ago, shortly after Mr. Patterson's death. The authorized signatory on these withdrawals was your son, Richard Harold Patterson. We urge you to contact our offices at your earliest convenience to discuss this matter." I read the letter 3 times. Then I read it again. The words swam in front of my eyes, rearranging themselves into impossible sentences. $750,000. A trust fund. Monthly payments of $3,500. I had been living on $650 a month. I had been eating canned soup and stale bread. I had been wearing the same clothes for years, rationing my medications, turning off the heat in winter to save money. And my husband had left me $750,000. And my son had taken every penny. I didn't call the law firm. Not right away.
First, I needed to understand.
I needed to think. I needed to process the magnitude of what I had just learned. I spent 3 days in a fog. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I sat in my small apartment and stared at the walls, replaying every moment of the last 8 years in my mind. Richard's enormous house, Victoria's designer wardrobe, the private schools, the luxury vacations, the expensive cars, my 1-bedroom apartment, my ration meals,
My sold wedding ring.
my loneliness. It all made sense now. Horrible, devastating sense. On the 4th day, I called my sister. Margaret was 75 years old and lived in California. We hadn't spoken in months, not because we didn't love each other, but because long-distance calls were expensive and I was always trying to save money. Money I apparently had. Money that had been stolen from me. "Eleanor." Margaret's voice was surprised but warm. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said, and then I told her everything. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then Margaret spoke, and her voice was pure steel. "I'm coming to see you. And I'm bringing my attorney." Margaret arrived a week later. She walked into my tiny apartment and stood in the middle of the room, looking around with an expression of barely contained fury. "This is where he put you?" she demanded. "This is how your son let you live?" "I thought this was all I had," I whispered. "I thought Harold left debts." "Harold was the most financially responsible man I ever met," Margaret snapped. "He planned everything. He told me, Eleanor. He told me about the trust. He said he wanted to make sure you were taken care of, that you would never have to worry about anything. He told you. At Christmas, the year before he died. He was so proud of it. He said it was the best thing he had ever done for you." Tears streamed down my face. "Then why didn't you say anything? All these years, why didn't you ask?" Margaret's face crumbled. "Because I assumed you were receiving it. When I saw how you were living, I thought maybe you were just being frugal. You were always so careful with money. I never imagined." She couldn't finish the sentence. We held each other and cried. For Harold. For the years I had lost. For the betrayal that neither of us had seen coming. Margaret's attorney was a woman named Patricia Chen. She was small and fierce, with eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for destroying fraudulent trustees in court. She reviewed the documents from the law firm, made some calls, and confirmed everything. The trust had been legitimate. The $750,000 had been real. And Richard had drained it all within 2 years of Harold's death, using a power of attorney I had apparently signed, but didn't remember signing. "He probably slipped it in with the funeral paperwork," Patricia explained. "People sign dozens of documents when a spouse dies. They're grieving. They're overwhelmed. They trust their family members to guide them." "I trusted him," I said, my voice breaking. "He was my son." "I know," Patricia said gently. "And that's exactly what he counted on." I didn't confront Richard right away. I needed time. I needed a plan. I needed to understand who my son really was, this stranger wearing my child's face. I started paying attention. When Richard called, I listened to the subtext beneath his words. When he mentioned his investments and his business successes, I heard the echo of my stolen money. When he complained about expenses and said things were tight, I calculated the interest on $750,000 and felt sick. And then there was Melissa. My granddaughter was 17 years old, on the cusp of adulthood, caught between the privilege of her parents' world and something deeper, something more uncertain. She had always been different from her brother Thomas. Quieter, more observant, more troubled by things that didn't add up. She started visiting me without her parents' knowledge. She would take the bus across town and knock on my door, and we would sit together drinking tea like Dorothy and I used to do. Dorothy had passed away 2 years earlier, and I had been alone ever since. "Why do you live here, Grandma?" Melissa asked one afternoon. "Why don't you live with us? We have so much room." "Your father thinks this is better for me," I said carefully. "More independence." "But you're 80 years old. You shouldn't have to be independent. You should be taken care of." I looked at my granddaughter, really looked at her, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. I saw myself. I saw a young woman beginning to question, beginning to doubt, beginning to wake up. "Melissa," I said slowly, "sometimes the people we love don't love us the way we deserve. Sometimes we have to find the courage to see the truth, even when it hurts." She stared at me with wide eyes. "Are you talking about Dad?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not yet. 3 weeks before my birthday, Richard called to invite me to dinner. "We want to do something special, Mom," he said in that oily voice I had finally learned to hear. The whole family together. A real celebration. Something felt wrong. He was too eager, too enthusiastic. He had never cared about my birthday before. "That sounds lovely," I said, keeping my voice neutral.
"Great.
Victoria's planning everything. It's going to be incredible." I agreed to come. But this time, I wasn't walking in blind. This time I had a plan. Margaret came with me to the birthday dinner. Richard hadn't invited her, but I didn't care any more about what Richard wanted. Patricia Chen was waiting at Margaret's hotel, ready to move forward with legal proceedings the moment I gave the word. Richard's house was even more obscene than I remembered. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, art on the walls that probably cost more than my entire life savings. Victoria greeted us in a silk dress that screamed wealth, her smile faltering when she saw Margaret beside me. "Margaret," she said, her voice strained. "What a surprise." "I'm sure it is," Margaret replied coolly. Dinner was tense. Richard made small talk about his business ventures, his investments, his plans for expansion. Victoria talked about her charity work, her garden club, her upcoming trip to Italy. Thomas, now 20 years old and already looking like a younger version of his father, discussed his internship at a prestigious firm. Melissa sat quietly, watching everything with those sharp, troubled eyes. I ate my food and said nothing. I was waiting. After dessert, when the coffee had been served and the conversation had lulled, Margaret cleared her throat. "Richard," she said, "I have a question for you." He looked up, surprised. "Of course, Aunt Margaret. What is it?" "I'm curious about something. Your mother has been living on less than $700 a month for the past 8 years. She's been rationing her food, selling her possessions, struggling to afford her medications." Margaret's voice was calm, measured, devastating. "Meanwhile, you've been living in a mansion, driving luxury cars, sending your children to private schools. How do you explain that?" Richard's face went pale. Victoria's hand froze with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. I'm not sure what you're asking," Richard stammered. "I think you know exactly what I'm asking." Margaret pulled a folder from her purse and laid it on the table. "Your father left Eleanor a trust fund of $750,000. You were appointed as trustee. You were supposed to ensure she received $3,500 every month for the rest of her life. Instead, you drained the entire account and left her with nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched my son's face cycle through expressions: shock, fear, calculation, and finally, something that looked almost like rage. Not guilt, not shame. Rage at being caught. "That's ridiculous," he said, his voice hardening. "Mom signed over those funds. She wanted me to invest them for her." "I never signed anything," I said quietly. It was the first time I had spoken in an hour. "Or rather, I signed things I didn't understand, things you told me were routine paperwork. You lied to me, Richard. You stole from me." "Mom, you don't know what you're talking about. You're old. You're confused." "I'm not confused." I felt something rising in my chest, something that had been buried for 80 years. My voice, my anger, my truth. "I know exactly what happened. I trusted you because you were my son. I believed everything you told me because I thought a mother's love meant never questioning, never doubting, never seeing the ugliness in her own child. But I see it now. I see you now." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "This is insane. I'm not going to sit here and be accused of fraud." Margaret interrupted. "Theft? Elder abuse? Because those are the charges my attorney is prepared to file." Victoria let out a small gasp. Thomas looked between his parents with growing horror. And Melissa, my quiet, observant granddaughter, reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled document she had shown me that morning. "I found this in Dad's office," she said, her voice shaking. "It's a bank statement. It shows transfers from Grandma's trust into your personal account. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, Dad. You took everything from her." Richard's face twisted into something ugly. "Melissa, stay out of this. You don't understand adult matters." "I understand that my grandmother has been eating canned soup while you bought Mom a $50,000 necklace for Christmas," Melissa shot back. "I understand that she sold her wedding ring while you took us on vacation to Europe. I understand that you're a thief and a liar, and I'm ashamed to be your daughter." The words hung in the air like knives. Victoria started crying. Thomas stood up and left the room. Richard just stood there, exposed, stripped of all his pretenses, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. "Richard," I said, and my voice was steady now, steady and strong and clear. "I spent my whole life being quiet, being invisible, being the woman who served and sacrificed and never asked for anything in return. I thought that was love. I thought that was what a good mother did. But I was wrong. A good mother also has to know when to stop accepting crumbs, when to demand what she deserves, when to say, "This is not love. This is abuse." I stood up, and Margaret stood with me. "My attorney will be in contact," I continued. "You will return every dollar you stole. You will face the legal consequences of your actions. And you will live the rest of your life knowing that your own daughter saw who you really are." I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Richard's voice, thin and desperate.
Mom, wait.
"Please. I can explain. I did it for the family. I did it for everyone." I stopped but didn't turn around. "You did it for yourself," I said. "And that's the one thing I can never forgive." The weeks that followed were a storm. Patricia filed charges. The media picked up the story. Headlines screamed about elder fraud and family betrayal. Richard's business partners distanced themselves. Victoria filed for divorce. And me? I moved out of Sunset Gardens. Margaret found me a beautiful apartment with big windows and a garden view. Patricia ensured that the stolen money, plus interest, was returned to me. I hired a caretaker, a kind woman named Rosa, who reminded me that being cared for wasn't weakness. Melissa came to live with me during her senior year of high school. Her father didn't fight it. He was too busy fighting everything else. She applied to colleges with essays about truth and courage, and the grandmother who taught her that silence wasn't the same as peace. I was 80 years old. I had spent my whole life being invisible. But in the end, I found my voice. I found my worth. I found the strength to say no more. Some nights, I sit by my window and watch the sunset. I think about Harold and wonder if he knew what Richard would become. I think about the years I lost and try not to let the bitterness consume me. I think about Melissa and feel hope for a generation that refuses to look away from ugly truths. The world teaches women like me to be small, to be grateful, to accept whatever scraps were given and call it enough. But I have learned, at the end of my life, that we deserve more than scraps. We deserve the whole feast. We deserve to be seen, heard, valued, and loved. Not for what we give, but for who we are. I am Eleanor Marie Patterson. I am 80 years old. I am no longer invisible. And I am finally free.